Grocery costs are outpacing the overall inflation rate, according to figures released by UBS economists. Joining me now live is Chief Investment Officer at the Motley, Scott Phillips. Scott, thank you for joining us. Good to see you. How high did prices climb in April?
Danica, good to see you as well. This is a remarkable story. Look, we should remember, of course, the inflation number is an average, so something's going to be higher, something's going to be lower. But we've known for months now that the non-discretionary items, the things we need, food, fuel, energy, have outpaced the rise in prices of those discretionary items, things we can afford to do without. And that's what's made this particular inflation outbreak so really painful for so many people watching and people around the country, because it is those things we can't avoid. The humble Vegemite was highlighted as one of the key products that has continued to increase in price. It also comes at the same time as the retailers are being accused of profiteering with higher gross margins. I think that's a little bit overdone for the record, but certainly this is very much the battle line when it comes to inflation. It is the stuff that we really need to get under control before the RBA can say outright that this inflation war has been won.
Yeah, it's getting harder, and they say it will not ease until later this year, Scott, so still some pain to come possibly. Let's move on now. What does Joe Biden's promise of access to the US Inflation Reduction Act, what does that mean, particularly for Australian projects?
We don't know yet, Danica, and one of those strange things that only politicians can do. Joe Biden's going to call Australian suppliers domestic suppliers in the US, so the politicians can redefine terms as they need. The good news is for us, Australian companies then become eligible for some of this $100 billion worth of spending. There's a lot of money out there to be potentially gained. Resource companies, most likely battery metals, lithium, rare earths in particular, seem to be the businesses that are most likely to be able to supply the US under this deal. It's also a really important one because it really cements again what is obviously an ongoing and very strong friendship between our two countries, but from a trade perspective as well, it brings Australia inside the tent, further inside the tent, when it comes to US projects, strategic and otherwise, and obviously good news for our businesses. We don't yet know how much of that money might be spent on Australian products by Australian companies, but obviously right now the number is zero. Anything more is good news. It comes, of course, at the same time as we've been able to lower trade barriers with China. Last week, $1.6 billion worth of timber was re-welcomed into China. I've got to say, when the economy's slowing, when we're sailing into tougher waters, these two bits of news are really good news for Australian industry, for Australian workers, the economy as well, because these are export earnings. They are really, really important when it comes to a slowing economy.
Oh, that's really good to hear, particularly in this climate. Look, just finally, this is an interesting one, this second wave of industrial relations reforms. There's been a lot of opposition to Labor's proposal here. This morning on the front page of The Australian, it's reporting that BHP is warning that these new laws will cost business about $1.3 billion a year. What do you make of it, Scott?
So this is huge. And look, there are always two sides to any of these conversations. The first case, if contract workers aren't being paid the same as full-time workers, there's a very reasonable question to say, well, that doesn't seem particularly reasonable. There are minimum wages and conditions for a reason. So same pay for same work makes a whole lot of sense on one level. On the other, companies use contract workers because they need the flexibility. Contract workers themselves often choose to work in contract roles for the flexibility as well. And again, they're simply just cheaper for business. So as you say, up to $1.3 billion. Now, it is that business group saying that, so we can probably shave a couple of percentage points off it. But the reality is that by definition, these contracts are being used because they're cheaper. When and if the government says the companies must pay the same rate, it is going to push up wages. There's a couple of impacts. The first, of course, good for those workers. That's a positive. But it does potentially mean higher inflation. Anything going into extra wages gets spent in the economy. Those workers probably well and truly deserve it, but it goes into the economy, adds to demand. And then, of course, for shareholders, it decreases company profits, or those inflationary costs get passed on to customers as higher prices. So there's a few different moving parts here. Depends on what side of the political spectrum you want to sit. But the very reality is, as you pointed out, up to $1.3 billion worth of incremental costs if and when these policies are made into law.
I'm sure we're going to hear more debate on this. Scott Phillips, good to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.